Francis, a knight in monk's clothing, 1205, Assisi, in central Italy.
The sun had set an hour ago, and the dark piazza was deserted except for a young man in an old patchwork cloak. Like all towns, the streets of Assisi could be dangerous at night, but he walked confidently across the familiar square. Over his left shoulder towered the cathedral. Behind it, tall houses of nobles climbed the mountainside. To his right, across the piazza, began the jumble of narrow wooden houses rented by the working class. The sounds of laughter and a fiddle drew him to a tavern at the far corners of the piazza. A dim patch of light fell across the step as he flung open the door. "I hear songs of Charlemagne and the Knights of the Round Table," he shouted. Two young men jumped up from their table. "Francis has returned!" cried Thomas. "And he is overdressed even for a knight," laughed Angelo. Francis threw a bag of money to the tavern keeper. "This should cover my friends and I for the night," he said. "We have a lot of catching up to do." Thomas and Angelo slapped him on the back and drew him to their table. "Tell us what happened out there, Francis." "The stinking Perugians stripped me of my armor and weapons. They would have killed me if they had known I was just a squire. Mother said it was my vanity that saved me, since I had insisted on dressing like a knight." He shook his head. "It cost my father a load of his best silk to replace that exquisite sword. It cost him a lot more than that to pay the ransom for you and to bring you home from that dungeon. He only paid it because he was so ashamed I had been captured." Thomas frowned suddenly. "Be thankful that you were spared, Francis. Many of Assisi's sons died in the battle of Callistrata." Francis grew quiet. "I know that better than you. I saw the broken bodies of our friends on that battlefield as the Perugians dragged me off." His companions looked away. "Assisi wasn't ready for that fight," said Angelo. "We still aren't, and I'm tired of this civil war," said Francis. "I've pledged my new sword to Count Gentile as his squire. We're joining Walter de Brienne's campaign in Apulia against the Germans." Thomas stared at him. "Surely your father objects to you going off to battle again." "He can't tell me what to do. I'm a grown man now, and I'm going to make my own fortune as a knight." "Peter Barnardone is a shrewd businessman. He's not going to keep supporting you if you don't help him with his cloth business. I doubt even the Count is as wealthy as your father." Francis shrugged. "Lady chivalry cannot be so easily dismissed. To fight noble battles, to meet beautiful women, to inspire troubadours, to sing of my exploits, this is what I was born to do, like Charlemagne and Walter de Brienne." Francis waved the tavern keeper to their table. "Another round, my man, to Walter and the life of chivalry." "To Walter!" they shouted. Thomas drained his mug and stood. "In honor of his return, I declare Sir Francis, the Lord of the Revels." "Only someone with his wardrobe could have such a title," declared Angelo with a wink. "Where did that ridiculous cloak come from, anyway?" "I made it." "Why did you use a dozen different fabrics?" "Because I can." Angelo burst into laughter. "What songs you shall inspire!" He threw his head back and bowed his fiddle. "These are the tales of Sir Francis," he crooned, "who slayed the silk and captured the velvet with his mighty needle." Francis dragged them toward the door. "Come on, Thomas, there must be something more interesting to do than let Angelo make our ears bleed." They burst out of the tavern, singing, into the dark, damp streets. It was nearly sunrise when Francis went to sleep. He was still excited about his new armor and dreamed of a large palace with helmets, spears, and shields covering the walls. Whose are these? He wondered, admiring the shining display. He saw no one, but heard a voice, clear and confident. They are destined for you and your knights. He slept contentedly until midday. It took several months for Count Gentile to gather his army and provisions. Francis's mother begged him not to go, but he was determined to become the hero the troubadours sang of, and the dream had boosted his confidence. So Francis rode out of Assisi for the second time, splendid in his gleaming chainmail and riding an elegant horse. The caravan wound slowly across the countryside below Assisi, and soon the town had disappeared from their view. It was a long day of riding. At Spoleto, they stopped for the night, and the camp was soon buzzing with disturbing news. Walter de Brienne has died in battle in Apulia. Francis was stunned and suddenly felt exhausted. His head throbbing, he curled under his blanket and began to drift to sleep when he heard someone say, "Where are you going, Francis?" "Walter's campaign against the Germans must go on," he murmured sleepily. "It's my destiny to become a great knight." "Who will reward you more for your deeds, the Lord or the servant?" "The Lord, of course." "Then why are you leaving the Lord for the servant?" His head was foggy with sleep. "Who are you? What do you want me to do?" "Return home, and you will be told. The weapons you saw in your dream are not for you, Francis. Your palace will be far different from what you expect." He jumped up and peered intently into the dark, but saw only his companions snoring beside the fire. Was I dreaming? Was the Count talking in his sleep? Francis rolled himself back up in his blanket, but he couldn't get comfortable. What other kinds of weapons and palaces are there? What is my destiny, if not a life of chivalry? All night he tossed and turned, plagued by his doubts. When day broke, he gathered his pack and his weapons, and announced that he was going back to Assisi. "Worthless squire!" Count Gentile spat at him. "I should have known that a skinny, spoiled boy like you wasn't trustworthy. Go home before I send you home in pieces." "I didn't quit," Francis explained to his friends when he returned to Assisi so quickly. "Walter is dead. I'll go back when someone worthy takes up his sword." But he muttered to himself, "Some knight I turned out to be." To his father's glad surprise, he spent many hours helping in the shop on the first floor of their house. He waited on customers, he delivered orders to the nobles, he went into the slums and supervised workers dyeing fabric in big vats. Peter Bernardone decided that perhaps his son was going to make him proud after all. In his free hours, Francis wandered the countryside below the town, questioning his destiny. If I am not to be a knight, what am I to do with my life? Be a cloth merchant like my father? The idea did not appeal to him. One morning, he stood at the counter in the shop, tallying the price of an order on his father's abacus. Colorful stacks of fine wool and delicate silk spilled out of a row of bins. Peter kept the bins propped off the floor to protect his goods from the rainwater and sewage that ran down from the higher parts of town. The door creaked open and someone shuffled in. Francis shifted the wooden beads of the abacus and glanced up. "Yes?" An old man stepped forward into the light, and Francis smelled him before he saw the filthy breeches and the one red, shriveled hand. "Please, young man, in the name of God, give a poor cripple some food." Francis jumped up and threw open the door. "Get out of here, old man. This shop is for paying customers, not beggars. Please, in the name of God, go!" The old man hobbled out, and Francis slammed the door. Turning to the abacus again, he suddenly realized how little money it would take to help the beggar. You'd lend him the money if he was a count, he thought, and a crippled old man needs it much more than a count. He snatched up a pouch of coins and ran out to the street. The old man was shuffling toward another shop. "Wait!" Francis called. He ran to the beggar and pressed the pouch into his good hand. "I'm sorry I was so rude. Take this. It will buy you enough bread for a month." The old man grinned at him with rotten teeth. "God bless you, my son." Francis went back to the shop. "I'll never again turn away someone who asks for help in God's name," he promised. That night at the tavern he was quiet while his friends sang battle songs. "Francis is bored," Thomas said, yanking Angelo's fiddle out of his hands. "Let's go steal a horse." They moved toward the door, but Francis didn't get up. "Francis, are you daydreaming?" "Perhaps he's thinking of a beautiful woman," teased Angelo. "Did you choose a wife and forget to tell us?" Francis smiled. "I'm going to bring home a bride more beautiful and noble than you can imagine." His friends laughed and slapped him on the back. "Come on, lover boy." "I used to think Lady Chivalry was my destiny," he thought. "But these days it is Lady Poverty who haunts me. Perhaps the voice I hear in my dreams is God." He got to his feet and absently followed his companions out of the tavern. In the days that followed, he began to spend more time in the fields below the town. His father owned several farms, payments from nobles who purchased his finest fabrics. Francis gladly escaped the stench and closeness of the overcrowded town, wandering in the fresh air through olive groves and wheat fields. The peace and beauty of nature seemed to calm his troubled soul. Some days Angelo went with him. His friend would sit at the mouth of a small cave and whittle sticks while Francis prayed inside. "Do you ever get that feeling that God is trying to tell you something?" Francis asked him as they sat on the rocks. Angelo raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I'm not sure." He looked away. "My possessions seem like a burden, and I wonder if I would be better off without them." "Is this another of your practical jokes?" "No, Angelo. Look at these wheat stalks. All they need are the soil, rain, and sun that God gives them. In return, they praise Him by growing into beautiful, fruitful fields. So why do we think we need palaces full of swords and tapestries? Why are we not satisfied with the food and shelter God provides?" "You're serious, aren't you?" Francis turned to him with earnest eyes. "I think God wants me to do something big, something more noble even than knighthood, if that is possible. I just don't know what it is yet." One autumn day, when Angelo was busy in town, Francis wandered further into the hills than usual. Rounding a clump of cypress trees, he came upon a tiny old chapel, one of many that dotted the Italian countryside. It was crumbling, small piles of broken stone lying where they had tumbled from the walls. An inscription honoring Saint Damiano was almost worn away. Inside a hedge, Francis could see that someone had scratched out a sparse garden next to a little hut. It was probably a lone priest who tended the chapel. Only the beans had grown with any success. He slipped into the building, a small sanctuary the only room. It was cool and dark inside. A cross with flaking paint hung over a low altar. Francis kneeled in the silence. Lord, I seek your will. If I am not to become a knight, what would you have me do? He had lost track of how long he had been praying when he heard a voice. Francis, don't you see that my house has collapsed? Go and repair it for me. He glanced behind him, but the chapel was empty. Was God speaking to him again? Repair my house, Francis. Yes, that's it, thought Francis. Lots of knights sponsored church repairs. These walls need new stones, and the lamps need oil, and the priest could probably use some meat. Yes, Lord, I will willingly repair your house, he said aloud. There was no answer. He got to his feet and went outside. A shabby priest was coming through the hedge and looked up at his visitor in surprise. Hello, Father Giovanni. Francis recognized him from the market in Assisi. He quickly reached into his money pouch and pressed several coins into the priest's hand. Please, take this, he said. Use it to keep the lamps burning and to buy yourself some food. The Lord bless you, said the priest, dazed. I'm surprised that a young prankster like you would be interested in spiritual things. That's just a deposit, Francis promised. I will be back with more. He returned to Assisi that night, excited about his new quest. In the morning, he went down to the shop on the first floor and examined his father's inventory. Peter was on another buying trip in France, and Francis wasn't about to wait until he got back to discuss his plan. He gathered up as much of the fine fabric as he could bundle onto a horse and set out for the nearby town of Foligno. His father had several regular customers there. It didn't take long to sell everything, including the horse. Francis tied the bursting money bag onto his belt, tucked it into his breeches, and walked back to San Damiano Chapel. But Father Giovanni refused the money. The church is no place for practical jokes. No, you don't understand. This is a sincere donation to rebuild San Damiano. The priest hesitated. Your father sent you to bring this? No, my father doesn't even know about it. I sold a load of cloth and a horse. You stole this money? Demanded Giovanni. He thought, and worse, you stole it from Peter Bernardone? He's a powerful man. It's my inheritance, Francis insisted, so it's really my money, and there is a lot here. I will pay for all the necessary repairs. I'm sorry, Francis. I can see that your heart is good, but I cannot take this. Well, I'm not keeping it. Francis stomped his foot and tossed the money through a high window. The bag lodged on the crumbling windowsill. Giovanni shook his head. I guess money isn't the only thing I have to give, thought Francis. God told me to repair this church, and I'm going to do it if I have to use my own hands. The priest grinned. That offer I can accept. Francis got to work clearing the rubble. Father Giovanni let him stay in his hut, and over the next few days they erected scaffolding and inspected the broken roof tiles. But his work was soon interrupted by a message from Peter Bernardone. Father has returned to Assisi and discovered his missing inventory, Francis told the priest in a rush. He's very angry. Giovanni shrugged as if to say, I told you. I need to disappear for a while, Francis declared, but I will be back. You have my word as a knight. For a month he hid in the cave where he had prayed with Angelo. He felt guilty for promising Giovanni he would repair the chapel and then leaving before the work was done. If I go back, I'll have to face my father, he thought. All he understands is making money. He cannot see the value in giving it away. Yes, he was convinced now that God was calling him to give away his possessions. But if I don't go back, I can't complete my quest. He prayed for guidance. Finally, he decided to return to Assisi. But he wouldn't go home. He would just ask his friends for food and building supplies, so he could get back to his work at San Damiano. He would do it without his father. He reached the city gates before nightfall and headed toward the piazza. But the whole town knew his father was looking for him, and Peter had been alerted as soon as Francis came through the gates. He was waiting for him in front of the tavern with some of his men. "Where have you been?" Peter demanded. "You look like a leper." That much was true. He hadn't eaten or bathed in a month. He was filthy, skinny, and his beard had grown long. No wonder people had hurried to get out of his way as he came into town. Francis stood his ground. "I have been praying and fasting." "Don't pretend to be a holy man, Francis. You are just a thief and a coward. Is this how you repay me for the ransom I paid when you were so foolish to be captured in battle? Is money all you care about? How can you despise all my years of labor? My grandfather was a serf. I have achieved so much more than he could have hoped for, and look how you squander it." He waved to his men. "Lock him in my cellar. He will stay there until he repays what he stole." They dragged him into the prison and left him in the dark. Memories of the Perugian dungeon came to him in a rush. "Well, this is certainly not a life of luxury," he told himself. "Lady Poverty would be pleased." A few weeks later, Father Giovanni was praying at San Damiano's altar when he heard approaching steps. "Francis, I didn't expect you to come back. I heard your father had locked you in the family prison." "He did," Francis said. "But as soon as he left on another buying trip, my mother let me out. She raised me to listen to God's voice, and I explained all about my desire to give up luxury and help those in need. So I have returned to complete my quest." Father Giovanni shook his head and smiled. "Your heart is good, but you know this is not over. As soon as your father returns to Assisi, he will come looking for you again." "Let him come. This time I will not run away." He took the priest by the arm and led him to a wheelbarrow outside the hedge. "Look what I brought. I spent the last few days begging bricks from the kind people of Assisi. There are enough here to begin rebuilding the walls." "I don't know what to make of you, Francis," said Giovanni. "You beg not for bread, but for stones." They spent days digging out the crumbling stones, mixing fresh mortar and filling in the holes. Giovanni worked on the lower portion of the walls, and Francis worked on the higher levels. From the scaffolding, he could see across the hills to the road leading up to Assisi. "Ho there," he called to travelers on the road. "Stop for a while and help me with this load of bricks." But they took one look at the filthy young man shouting at them from the roof of a hovel and kept going. One afternoon, Francis was wiping the sweat from his brow when he noticed a rider approaching. He began to wave at the man and call out to him, but when he recognized the figure, he drew back. Peter Bernardone had returned to Assisi and was furious to find that Francis had escaped. "Get down from there at once," cried the merchant from his saddle. "It's time to stop this foolishness." Francis turned to face him, but did not climb down. "I can't leave until I have completed my quest," he replied. "Your quest? You still think you are a knight?" He didn't answer. "If you really believe in noble ideals, then you understand why I cannot allow you to steal from me just because you are my son. I have dedicated myself to the work of the Lord. The church is my authority now, not you." Father Giovanni peeked his head out of the doorway of the chapel, but they didn't notice him. "Bishop Guido is a friend of mine, Francis, and he is richer than I am," shouted Peter. "You do not want me to take my petition to him. He will certainly rule in my favor." Francis turned back to the wall and hefted a stone into place. Until the bishop instructs me to stop, I have a chapel to rebuild. Then you leave me no choice, Peter cried. You are a disgrace to the Bernardone name. He spun his horse around and galloped away. The priest looked up at the young man on the scaffold. You are not a disgrace. You are a knight in monk's clothing. Within days, Francis was summoned to trial. Giovanni insisted on going with him, and together they set out to climb the ridge toward the city. When they arrived, they were given rooms in the bishop's palace overnight. Francis accepted the offer of a bath, but refused to sleep in the comfortable bed. The next morning was cold enough that Francis could see his breath. He was surprised to discover a crowd of spectators shivering in Guido's courtyard. The whole town knows of this dispute between father and son, said Giovanni with a shrug. You may not be a knight, but you seem to have found fame anyway. Francis frowned and took his place before the bishop's couch in the center of the courtyard. Scanning the crowd, he noticed Angelo, who gave him an encouraging smile, but his confidence faded when his father stepped forward. Peter held his powerful chin high and said not a word to his son. Bishop Guido rose from his couch and called the people to order. He was a large man, and Francis noticed that under his heavy cloak he was dressed in Peter's finest linen. This trial shall begin, the bishop declared in a booming voice. Peter Bernardone, state your complaint. The merchant ignored the crowd and spoke directly to Guido. My son Francis stole from me a horse and goods from my shop. You asked him to return them? He refuses to repay his debt. I have appealed to this court because he claims the church's authority. Guido gestured to Francis with a heavy hand covered in rings. Is this true, young man? He stepped forward. I did sell goods from my father's shop, yes, but I did not keep the money for myself. I gave it to Father Giovanni to rebuild the chapel of San Damiano. He nodded at the priest, standing at the front of the crowd. Peter rolled his eyes. Charity does not justify thievery. Better that the money go to the Lord's work rather than be lost in your giant coffers, retorted Francis. Peter's face flushed red. I have spent years building an honest reputation, but you reject my hard work and bring shame to our family. Is it shameful to help the poor? Cried Francis. Is it shameful to follow Christ? Our Lord told the young nobleman to give away all his possessions. He told his disciples not to carry extra supplies on their journeys. He said whoever would follow him must deny himself. You hide behind the Holy Scriptures to justify your actions. Enough, boomed Bishop Guido. I have heard enough. The crowd grew quiet. Guido lowered himself onto his couch. You have rightfully devoted yourself to Christ, Francis, and your generosity toward the poor is commendable. He paused. But the cloth and the horse you sold belonged to your father. You cannot give to the Lord what is not yours to begin with. He will not honor works done in his name if you have broken his commandments to perform them. Francis hung his head in shame. I had not thought of it that way, he mumbled. If you wish to serve the Lord, you must return to your father everything you have taken. Francis looked at Bishop Guido's serious face, at Father Giovanni's threadbare tunic, at Peter Bernardone's soft cloak and leather shoes. Then I will restore what I have taken, he said suddenly. Wait here. He marched into the bishop's garden on the far side of the courtyard. Winter had stripped the leaves from the shrubs. Francis cupped a bare branch in his cold hands and stroked it tenderly. You don't complain about giving up your lush green companions, do you? You just glorify God in your loneliness and wait patiently for spring to arrive. He stepped into an alcove and removed his multicolored cloak now gray with dirt. Shivering, he removed the leather belt, the linen tunic, and the finely woven breeches. He folded each one, stacking them neatly into a pile, and put his money bag on top. When he stepped back into the courtyard, he was naked, carrying the stack of clothing in front of him. "What on earth?" Peter sputtered. "Have you completely lost your mind, Francis?" The young man pushed the pile of clothes into his father's hands. "You all are my witness," he yelled to the crowd. "I have returned every last item I ever received from Peter Bernardone. From this point on, my father is in heaven, not in Assisi." Bishop Guido rushed forward, removing his white mantle from his shoulders and wrapped it around Francis. "Trust in the Lord, my son, and he will provide you with all you need." "I do trust him," replied Francis, "and here and now I vow to devote my life to rebuilding his church, both the buildings of worship and the hearts of men." He tied the bishop's mantle around his waist and strode decisively out of the courtyard. Peter Bernardone stared after him, the stack of clothing in his arms. "Peace be with you, Bishop," mumbled Father Giovanni with a nod, and ran to catch up with Francis. "Sir Francis has chosen his quest," declared Angelo, pushing through the crowd, "and so have I." He pushed up his sleeves and went after them. Astonished, the spectators watched open-mouthed as the half-dressed young man and his two followers marched out the gates of Assisi and into the quiet countryside beyond. Francis became a troubadour for Lady Poverty, writing songs and poems about how God provided for all of his creation. He soon had many followers. They vowed to beg for everything they needed and tried to convince wealthy clergy to give their goods to the poor. Eventually, the Pope granted them permission to found a new order of monks, which became known as the Franciscans. Francis died in 1226 after suffering for many years from diseases caused by his rigorous lifestyle.